I never thought I would make a video about Contempt. This is a complicated movie that a lot of people have already taken a stab at. And let's face it, Godard is a lightning rod for pontification, and I don't really want to get caught up in that. So let me try to start from the humblest possible place and say simply that this movie has meant a lot to me over the years, and that it's undeniably a beautiful thing. At its core, I guess Contempt is a love story, but not one where people fall in love. It's about the end of a relationship that we never really see, because the movie starts when things begin to crumble, and we watch as this inexplicably but inevitably reaches its conclusion. Partly, this is a story about a husband and wife, Paul and Camille, but maybe it's also a story about movies and about French culture. For some people, everything starts from the context of the film's production. It's essential to know this to understand the movie to some people. This was Godard's first and really his only big budget movie. This isn't a street film. It doesn't even take place in France. Brigitte Bardot's salary took up half the film's budget. She was a bona fide global star in 1963. Jack Palance and Fritz Lang were also quite well known. Michel Piccoli was maybe on the rise a little bit, but clearly we've got a big cast here. We also have CinemaScope and Technicolor. Fritz Lang in the movie says that CinemaScope is only for filming snakes and funerals. Well, this movie's in CinemaScope, and it sort of is a funeral to some extent. The film was produced by Carlo Ponti and the American Joseph E. Levine. So there are some clear signs of self-reference here, which is one of Godard's most widely known hallmarks. In the opening scene of the film, after the iconic credits, we see Paul and Camille in bed. This was apparently added at the request of Joseph E. Levine, who seemingly wanted to get more of Bardot's body on film, to cash in on that. In 1963, most Hollywood films were still fairly conservative, but in the foreign market, sex was not only acceptable, but possibly some kind of sign of sophistication. Of course, Godard does his best to sabotage this scene with some inexplicable stylistic choices. And if you listen to what Camille says, it's interesting. She describes herself not as a woman, but as a handful of appendages, arms, legs, hands. This is a somewhat lesser-known Godard trope. It shows up in Breathless as well, for instance, where he seemingly has this tendency to break women into pieces. There's different ways to interpret this. Perhaps it's a comment about what film cameras usually do to women, not just misogyny, but also metonymy. Either way, this is quite different from the sexy opening shot that producers might have hoped for. You might consider the film And God Created Woman as a comparison for this one. Before we throw Joseph E. Levine under the bus entirely here, though, before we draw a line between him and Prokofiev, the goofy American producer in the film, it's worth pointing out that Levine produced quite a few interesting and edgy movies, like The Night Porter, directed by Liliana Cavani, or The Graduate. And, of course, he produced Contempt, one way or the other. To me, this background information is interesting, and it gives you an angle on these scenes, but I don't think you need to know any of it to appreciate the movie or to see what Godard is doing. And I think it's a mistake to think of the movie as mere self-reference or to get too caught up in how Godard's choices might have been influenced by production logistics. It seems, in some ways, like the crucial moment in the film is when Paul lets Camille ride with Prokofiev. It might seem like he's doing something nice. It might seem like he's being secure in his relationship and his masculinity. But in offering this paragon of French beauty and culture to an American, something goes wrong. It isn't clear at the time what this is, but we spend a fair amount of the movie, I guess, looking for the moment when things begin to fall apart. Now, I think this movie is actually quite a bit more complicated than this, but this is one way to start thinking about the movie. And if we read the story not just as a personal one, but also something about French cinema, we get one kind of standard angle of looking at this film. Again, it's fairly self-referential. It's a story about a French encounter with the world, mainly with America, with a culture being tempted by America, but somehow losing itself. So this movie, you might say, is some kind of elegy, I guess, for this relationship, but also for French cinema, I guess. In a bit, I'll talk about why it's maybe not that simple. You can flip it around a few different ways. But I want to talk about one of the most famous and longest scenes in the film. This is the somewhat anticlimactic argument in the apartment. Like I said, when we are watching this movie, we're kind of looking for a moment that they fall out of love. And this scene is no different. We're looking for the conflict, which is bubbling up, to come to a point, but we don't really get one. Classic Hollywood is, I guess, a cinema of decisive moments where a look, a shot, conveys some shift, some change. In this scene, we only get indecisive moments. It feels almost interminably long, like it's supposed to come to an end several times, but it doesn't. Like it's supposed to reach a climax several times, but then it backs away from the edge, and it isn't decisive. The arguments don't end with a slap. They don't end when they seem to make up. They never seem to end or get much of anywhere. This isn't to say that things are entirely naturalistic. There's some structures in this scene, pretty interesting ones, like Paul's 3-part encounter with the door. Or you might notice at the beginning of the scene, Camille sets the table, and towards the end she cleans up the table, but they don't eat anything in between. This is, I guess, just some kind of ceremonial dinner. This whole thing is a bit of a domestic dress rehearsal, putting on clothes, taking them off. Godard is no stranger to the apartment, but he's never been one for a kitchen sink drama. Instead, we have something that is partly vaudevillian in its choreography, but also kind of awkward, stuttering, and naturalistic. So there is some formalism here, but it's not the classic stuff. Now, it's not really news that Godard likes to reject classic stuff, classic Hollywood things. But I mention it because there's some really beautifully indecisive moments in this movie and in this scene, like when Camille sticks her leg forward under Paul. It's a really weird gesture, filmed just showing their legs, essentially. Slightly tender gesture, slightly antagonistic, hard to read. And you might wonder, what's going on? Or why is this stuff in the movie? When we have this framework of decisive versus indecisive, though, I think some of these things start to come into focus a little bit. Maybe in part it's here to be in tension against the traditional decisive moment, where one look or one shot signifies that something big has happened, signifies that nothing will ever be the same again. I'm not sure that Godard plans all this out so much as that it was his sensibility. He spoke with a provocative grammar, you know? Another example in this scene is the exchange between Paul and Camille that is filmed from the side, with the camera tracking back and forth between them. Most of the time, a decisive conversation would be filmed with a shot and a reverse shot. You'd look at one person over the shoulder of another. That's some of the most well-established film grammar there is. Over the years, people have figured out how even the smallest tweaks in timing and angle can emphasize different moments and bring out different emotions. When do you cut to showing someone's reaction? How much room do you give them above the other person's shoulder and such? It is very finely tuned, but Godard does not do this. It takes a very different approach to filming this conversation, strangely an alienating one in some ways. I don't know. I guess what some people would say, in that Godard, in giving us this kind of weird, uncinematic perspective, gives us something that's much closer to reality, or much more conspicuously non-cinematic, or something like that. Reality through rather conspicuous artifice. And that might sound like a paradox, but is it any more paradoxical than the invisible style of classic Hollywood? When I was watching this scene with the camera tracking back and forth, part of me was getting a bit anxious about how the shot would line up with the character. The camera starts out on one of them and slides over to the other, but this doesn't really sync up with who's speaking. One of them starts to talk and the camera's still drifting over to them, and you think, oh no, get over there. And maybe this is giving Godard too much credit, but this sense of unease over the missing synchronization, it reminded me of watching light poles fly by on the highway and trying to get them in the corner of your window or something like that. That might be exactly why he opted for this odd composition, the tension of the non-standard, non-classic storytelling. But there's something else important in this scene, too. There's a section where we get a big stylistic shift. Voiceover comes in, and we get some flashbacks to earlier parts of the movie. It's almost edited like today's reality television would be. This totally upsets the chronology, where the scene had, at one point, seemed to be a taut thread, inevitably leading towards some sort of conclusion. Suddenly, we jump into some sort of retrospective mode. We're in the past tense. Some of the lines here, I think, might be some of the sincerest things in the movie, though. Camille says, "We used to live in a cloud of unawareness, in a delicious complicity. Things happen with a sudden wild, enchanted recklessness." A sudden wild, enchanted recklessness. Paul goes on to say that things soured once they began to observe each other coldly, that enchantment and that recklessness was gone. I think in some ways this could be the crux of the movie, or part of it. It's a big moment to me. First of all, this is, story about a relationship, and I guess this is not an uncommon story for the beginning to be spontaneous, but for Contempt to set in later, once some sort of spark is gone, once familiarity has taken the place of novelty. Sudden, wild recklessness also might describe a lot of Godard's films. I said a moment ago that he speaks with a provocative grammar. A big part of that is spontaneity, impatience with convention. Something that's fairly widely discussed is how Godard's relationship with America changed. Between Breathless and Contempt, for instance. In Breathless, America is cool, or at least tempting. Michel Belmondo steals American cards and impersonates American celebrities in that movie. Maybe this is the wild, enchanted recklessness stage. Maybe we're talking about a relationship between France and America. In Contempt, Godard seems contemptuous of the Americans. He seems perhaps to be observing them coldly. Their relationship has soured. There's a few different ways to look at this, and you can see here an angle between romance, between national culture, and between film that is really at the crux of the movie. And when you start talking about the Odyssey and the classics, maybe you wonder about that too, how there could be some enchantment that would be lost. Now, if we really try to get too formal about this, things do get a bit confusing. I guess the question here is really, what does Camille stand for? Generally, she might seem to represent some aspect of French culture, but why would Godard once have been in love with French culture but come to resent it? Maybe it's the presence of outside influence that has broken down the spontaneity, where once Paul and Camille once lived a beautiful, enchanted life together, they've been disillusioned by their brush with the global economy. They've been corrupted. They've been, corrupted. But there's other ways of viewing it too. There's a lot of things Camille could kind of stand in for. The French public, the French mainstream, or something more traditional, right? Is she supposed to be standing in for Godard's other works, for the enchantment of the New Wave films, or something more classic, either classic American cinema or classic French cinema? Remember, Bardot was quite famous, conspicuously famous, and there was perhaps even some level of resentment from some New Wave directors towards her fame. There's a number of Bardot films where she contends with being famous, at one point even being trampled by paparazzi. So it's a little clear. Maybe she also just stands for truth itself, or beauty, or something like that. I've seen different people making different claims. And what that means to me is that maybe we shouldn't be putting this metaphor under the microscope too closely, but should instead see this as some kind of treatise about the enchantment and disenchantment of different ways of seeing, and how those come into play in our personal, our cultural, and our artistic, and our national lives. It's interesting that being able to observe something coldly is seen as a bad thing here. At some level, Godard is interested in reality and seeing things clearly. Some people would tell you that that's one of the ideas behind the New Wave, is that we want to see, is that it's supposed to be some form of realism, as circuitous a path towards reality as it might take. But it seems like maybe he's not so interested in observing things coldly. Instead, it seems that a certain playfulness and sarcasm is important to him when it comes to looking at the world. Look at the world like someone in love. To look at the world like someone in love. That's what his films do, perhaps. But not this one. Or maybe this is the story of how that sort of viewership can wither when conditions are not right. Sometimes Godard's reality can seem a little bit inverted. Towards the beginning of the movie, Prakash gives a little speech about how there used to be real men at Cinecittà, real people. He's very conspicuously invoking reality in reference to classic cinema and characters who were, in fact, not real. Before too long, he's setting aside Fritz Lang, a person who was real, a real director in real life, but someone that Prakash would probably not describe as real. Of course, the movie starts with the camera turning to look at something else that is very real, which is us, the audience. These are kind of well-known Godard tropes, but I mention them because it's interesting to contrast this with what Godard says about how cold observation breeds contempt. Nonetheless, he is constantly sort of pointing to the real in this movie, even if in maybe a sort of oblique way. Anyway, Fritz Lang is also a somewhat loose character in the film. Some of the things he says sound like things that Godard would say, and you might be inclined to think of Lang as a stand-in for Godard. The anti-films of statues that Lang screens maybe seem like the sort of new wave modernism. And maybe the idea is that this is a self-deprecating satire about a bold new wave director who wants to direct the Odyssey, right? About the kind of movies that people like Godard would make. I'm not sure that's really the angle, though, because on the other hand, Fritz Lang is a lot older than Godard, and they don't hide his extensive filmography. So maybe he's more of an embodiment of classic cinema. And when you see the actual film they make, it's a classic film. The statue shots are weird, so it's a little hard to know. Are the statues alluding to the brittleness of the classic epic? Maybe. Like I said, the Lang character is a little bit back and forth. Keep in mind that Godard didn't really direct historical epics. He directed a lot of street movies that were kind of small in some ways, not the ambitious vanity film of the Odyssey. These statues, they punctuate the movie, and it can be a little bit hard to know what to make of them, but at times I think they seem sincere. The role of the Odyssey in Contempt is interesting. At first, it seems kind of satirical, the quintessential, overly ambitious project, the vanity film spawned by an American producer. Furthermore, Prokofiev and Paul's theory that Odysseus took 10 years to come home because he had fallen out with Penelope is a bit ludicrous, and Lang correctly, it would seem, identifies that as mapping modern neuroses onto ancient stories. Still, there seem to be some sincere moments, some kind of allure to this ancient story. Something to be said about how an ancient story in a modern film can make peace. And Paul seems personally drawn to the narrative too. There's a scene where they film Odysseus climbing onto a big rock, an island, I guess you would call that really seems to create some connection between Odysseus and Paul, just the way it's filmed. And think about how Paul wraps himself up in a toga during the apartment scene, although it's not entirely serious, I think. Somewhere wrapped up in this movie, though, is a big question about classics. What should we make of the classics? And there's one extreme option, which is that we should remake the classics into goofy new movies. But there's also more subtle approaches. There are moments where Paul is tempted to think of himself as a Greek, or at least tempted to dress himself as one. There's some allure to this stuff. It can't help but be reminded a little bit, Paul in the toga, to Belmondo in front of the mirror in Breathless. We could think about the Odyssey, maybe, and the old classics as a stand-in for classic cinema. There's something comforting about classic cinema. Even the staunchest of the avant-garde are tempted to co-opt its style from time to time. I think this view gives us an interesting way to think about the end of the movie in particular. There's an interesting little detail at the end here, which is that in the last scene, Fritz Lang is filming a critical moment in the Odyssey. Ulysses' gaze, when Odysseus first glimpses his homeland of Ithaca again. Ulysses, Odysseus, same thing. I say Ulysses' gaze because there's a film called Ulysses' Gaze, directed by Theodoros Angelopoulos and starring Harvey Keitel of all people. But this moment, Ulysses' gaze, is when he first sees Ithaca again, his homeland. We're not talking about Ithaca, New York, to be clear. If this was Ithaca, New York, it would be no mystery why it took him 10 years to return. But I guess you would think, for the most part, that the ending of this movie is downcast. Camille is gone. Paul is alone. Sort of feels like a failure. Sort of feels a sense of regret and heartbreak or something. Some sort of feeling of loss. And yet, they're filming this scene where Odysseus sees Ithaca again, which is in some ways sort of an upbeat thing. How do we reconcile these two different ideas? Well, maybe if we see this as an arm of classic cinema, we can reconcile these two moods pretty easily. Of course, we see conspicuously the camera and the crew that's filming this scene, so it's clear that this is some kind of illusion, that this joyous, I guess, moment of Ulysses' gaze is some kind of illusion that coexists with Paul's bitter end. It's also worth noting that while Odysseus is supposedly looking at Ithaca, what we see is him looking out at the ocean and the horizon. There's nothing there. There's no homeland there. And then we get silence in the end of the movie. So perhaps we shouldn't be thinking about this moment as a positive exactly. Despite how it might seem in some ways like a nostalgic reunion, it's in fact some sort of empty and fake thing. And like I said, maybe this is looking at the classics, looking at classic Hollywood as giving us a fake nostalgic homecoming, right? I think that's an interesting angle, but this does break down a little bit when you start to think about Fritz Lang. Yeah, I don't know. It doesn't exactly come off like a classic director in this film, but I'm not sure. And the statues, again, those don't have classic style. I don't know. So again, I think it's a case where we probably shouldn't be looking for something super precise. There are quite a few people who have done close readings of this movie, talking about the color of the robes that Camille wears or the interior design of their apartment. People really like talking about color and Godard. And I'm sure maybe some of these things are reasonable, but I have to admit that personally, you've almost always lost me if you start talking about colors in a movie. I'm out. Not always, but I don't know. There's something about that just sounds to me, I just always think it's someone's like 10th grade English essay when they're talking about the colors. In this movie, I've never really found these close readings to be very convincing. Your mileage may vary, but I don't think Godard is really a super precise director. I don't know. Maybe if you read some of his stuff in the Cahiers or something like that, you see that everything is very closely considered, and that that's your hook into thinking about things at that level. But for me, I don't know. That isn't to say the movies aren't deep, you know. If anything, the looseness stirs the pot, bangs a few ideas together in a compelling way, right? Clearly, lots of interesting colliding ideas here. Lots of interesting metaphors coming from these collisions and such. I want to look at this movie from a completely different angle now for a minute. Contempt has a lot of aphorisms in it, a lot of quotations. A lot of Godard films have a lot of aphorisms in them, little quips, sayings, quotes, gathered from the four corners of some vast but fashionable library. Not just this movie, a lot of Godard movies are textured by these incessant quotations. Apparently, a young Godard stole books from his grandfather's library and sold them to the local bookstore. So maybe this obsession with literary theft goes back before the cinema even. Speaking of theft, I'm leaning a bit here on an essay by Richard Locke. Not a very good essay in my opinion, but he makes some interesting observations about the aphorisms. Different people might have different reactions to all these quotes. It can be tempting when you're watching an intellectual movie to think, wait, stop. What was that? Write that down. Write that down. What did he say? Here's the new maxim to guide my life. On the other hand, some people might find this all a bit off-putting, thinking that Godard is trying to flex on everybody by throwing in a bunch of pretentious quotations. I don't think either of these extremes is quite right. I see all these quotations as a playful sampler of the intellectual world. I mentioned earlier how Godard lets ideas and images bang into each other. I think he's at it again. This is a director who works often more by montage than by narrative, right? Partly, this is a story about juxtaposition, but I also think there's something deeper going on here as well. To me, there's something important about how these quotations come to stand in for intellectualism itself. There is some process by which things are boiled down from a school of thought to a pithy sentence. And I think Godard is deeply interested in this boiling process. I mentioned earlier how in a lot of his movies he refers to women by their appendages. That's kind of a similar idea, objectification, imagification. Things without depth, without authority, without history. While Godard is a talisman for modern cinema, some people also talk about him as an early postmodernist, and this is why. Images without depth being an inherent thing in film. Of course, it's interesting to see that amidst all these images, we have the real Fritz Lang, and we have Jack Palance, who isn't exactly real. An interesting character, really, because he's playing a character, but if you compare this to a cowboy movie where he plays a villain, I feel like there's something different going on here. It's sort of more real in some ways. Anyway, look, I could go on and on and on about this movie, but let me talk a little bit about the new 4K remaster, which I saw at the Film Forum. It's good. What can I say? I was thrilled to get a chance to see this movie in a theater which was basically full, and it warms my heart to see people coming out on a Monday night to watch a weird movie from 1963. On the way home, I went by Bryant Park, and I saw that there was a Bryant Park movie night happening, which was absolutely packed. Like, no exaggeration, probably 4,000 people there. And before I saw the screen, I was thinking, well, they're probably watching Guardians of the Galaxy or something. But when I came around the corner, I saw that it was a black and white movie, none other than Roman Holiday. Warms my heart. Anyway, one note about the remaster was that I didn't think the score sounded that great. I guess there's only so much you can do, but the score is still one of the highlights of the movie. It's one of my all-time favorite scores, Georges Delerue, even though it's used kind of unconventionally. It just sort of drifts in and out of the movie. I think this was my fourth time seeing Contempt, and admittedly, it did not grab a hold of me quite as much as it did the first time I saw it, but this is still a legendary movie that completely delivers on its reputation. And I don't know, I'm glad to be watching another famous legendary movie again. Last time I went to the Film Forum was to see The Conformist. That's also based on a book by Alberto Moravia, which so is this movie. I didn't even mention that. I haven't read the book, so not going to get into that. But yeah, you know, and I think also maybe the last 2, 3, 4 movies on the channel, I felt like the movies haven't been able to reach quite the depth that I would usually like to, and I'm so busy at the moment that I kind of have to roll with those movies. If I watch a movie and it doesn't end up being quite as deep as I'd hoped, or if I end up not finding exactly enough material, I just make the video anyway, usually. So yeah, it's an honor to be back with this stuff, and I don't know, like I said, I feel like I just barely scratched the surface, but that's the joy of a movie like Contempt. Yeah, Godard might get on people's nerves. It gets on my nerves in some ways, but there's no denying that this movie has sparks and just has so many interesting things to think about and talk about. So hopefully that's a little taste. And look, if this new 4K remaster is showing anywhere near you, get thee to a theater and check it out.